It began with blood on the rain-slick street, and the sound of sirens tearing the night open, as Lena lay on a stretcher, with one hand pressed to her swollen belly, and the other reaching for nothing but cold air while medics shouted numbers she could not understand, and the city lights blurred into trembling stars above her. She tried to speak, but pain crushed the words backward into her throat, and all she could feel was the sharp wet heat spreading across her back where the knife had gone in. Then a man burst through the ring of uniforms, soaked to the skin with rain and terror in his eyes, and fell to his knees beside the ambulance door, as if the asphalt itself had broken him. "Do not touch her," he roared at the paramedics with a voice that did not belong to any sane world. "You will have to go through me first." Someone pulled him back, but he kept reaching forward as if his hands alone could hold her together. And when Lena turned her head, she saw Ethan Blackwell for the first time, not as a distant silhouette in the shadows of power, but as a man, shaking in helpless fear over her bleeding body. The siren swallowed his voice as the doors slammed shut, and the ambulance surged forward into the storm, and everything went white. 3 months earlier, Lena had been scrubbing marble floors in a midtown penthouse, long after midnight, when her phone vibrated with her mother's number, and the familiar dread settled into her bones even before she answered. "Come home now," Linda had said with a sweetness that never meant anything good. "There is someone who wants to meet you." When Lena stepped into the private lounge of a high-rise hotel, she smelled money and danger at the same time, and understood too late that she had been sold not for love, not even for pride, but for the chance to erase a debt her mother had carved into their lives for years. Behind one-way glass, a circle of men and women in tailored suits watched like buyers at an auction, while Lena stood in a simple dress borrowed from a stranger with her hands shaking at her sides. In the center of that silent court stood Ethan Blackwell, the youngest chief executive in the city, owner of hospitals and machines that promised to heal the future, and the only living thread of a bloodline that was quietly dying. His grandmother had spoken to him an hour earlier with the calm of stone. "The doctors were clear, Ethan," she said. "Without a miracle, the Blackwell name ends with you. We cannot wait anymore. Choose tonight." What no one in that room knew was the truth Ethan carried like a private grave. 5 years before, a highway accident had shattered nerves and certainty alike, and the specialists had delivered their verdict with professional mercy. "The damage is permanent," they had told him. "You cannot have children." He left the hospital that day with a body rebuilt and a future erased, and told no one, not his family, not his lovers, not even himself in the dark, when doubt came. That night he stood across from Lena with resignation masquerading as control, and she mistook his distance for cruelty and did not know it was despair. The choice was made without tenderness, without promises, without names spoken in full, and when the door closed behind them, both believed, for different reasons, that nothing lasting could come from what was about to happen. Dawn found Lena alone with a folded stack of bills on the bedside table, and no memory she could afford to keep, and it found Ethan staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. 3 weeks later, in a restroom that smelled of disinfectant and cheap soap, Lena watched 2 red lines surface with a quiet finality that stole the breath from her chest, and in that small silent space, the future shifted its weight and began to fall. She pressed her palm to the glass as if she could push the world back into place, and whispered his name, though she did not know if she meant the man from the rain, or the stranger from the dark room, or the shadow of a future that now refused to loosen its grip. Outside, the restroom door footsteps passed, and laughter rose and fell, unaware that a life had turned inside out within those narrow walls. Somewhere across the city, Ethan lifted his gaze from a boardroom table, with a sudden ache in his chest that he could not name, and for reasons he could not explain, the word impossible slipped from his mouth. Lena discovered the truth on a bathroom floor that did not belong to her, while the scent of bleach burned her nose, and the world tilted sideways with every wave of nausea that rose up from her stomach. She had been cleaning the west wing of a private mansion before sunrise, when the dizziness struck so suddenly that she barely reached the sink in time, and the thin, violent retching left her trembling and ashamed in a room larger than any she had ever slept in. When the shaking stopped, she sat back against the cold marble wall and pulled the test from her pocket with hands that would not steady, and the 2 red lines felt heavier than the walls around her. By the time she returned to her cart, the housekeeper was already watching her with narrowed eyes, and when Lena asked for a break, the answer came without sympathy. "You are replaced by noon," the woman said, and the words struck with the finality of a locked door. By nightfall, Lena stood in the crowded hallway of her apartment building, staring at the peeling doorframe that was no longer hers because the rent was late again, and the landlord had already changed the lock. She called her mother in tears, and Linda arrived an hour later, not with comfort but with calculation already sharp in her gaze. "You cannot keep it," Linda said flatly as she lit a cigarette beneath the flickering stairwell light. "Do you know how much trouble a baby costs? How much trouble you cost me already?" Lena tried to speak, but the sickness rose again and she braced herself on the stair rail as the world swam. Without waiting for permission, her mother grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a waiting car with a stranger behind the wheel, and whispered that a clinic would make everything disappear for the right price. Lena tore free and ran into the dark with her heart tearing open with every step, and she did not stop until the pain in her chest burned worse than the fire in her lungs. The city swallowed her, and she wandered without direction for hours until the nausea returned with such force that she collapsed against the brick wall of a pharmacy on the corner of an unfamiliar street. Cars passed without slowing, and voices drifted past without seeing her, and finally she slid down to the pavement and surrendered to the sickness shaking her to the bone. A man knelt beside her with a concerned voice cutting through the haze, and offered a bottle of water she barely had the strength to lift. "It will help," he said quietly as he pressed a tablet into her trembling palm when she could not stop retching long enough to speak. She swallowed because she had no other strength left, and when her vision cleared enough to see his face, she frowned with confused embarrassment, because he looked too polished for the street, with a coat too clean and eyes too careful to belong here. "Thank you," she whispered, when the medicine eased the heaving, and he only nodded as he helped her drink and steady herself without ever asking for her name. They parted without another word, and she never knew that the man who had given her that moment of mercy was Ethan Blackwell. By the time Lena reached the worn sofa she would sleep on for the night, inside a borrowed room, the weight of reality settled fully onto her chest, and she pressed both hands against her stomach, as if she could feel the faintest promise of two tiny heartbeats already beginning their silent work. The next morning Linda appeared without apology and without warning, and when Lena refused again, her mother slapped her so hard that her ears rang with the echo of betrayal. "I did not raise you to ruin me," Linda hissed through clenched teeth, and when Lena fell to the floor, the woman did not help her up but leaned closer and whispered that if she did not get rid of the baby, she would be thrown out of what little life she had left. That afternoon Lena rode the subway with tears staining the collar of her coat and pressed her forehead to the glass, while strangers stared at their phones, unaware that a war was forming inside her body. Every stop felt farther from safety, and every turn felt irreversible. Across the city, Ethan sat in his private office, staring at a medical report he had kept hidden for years, while the memory of the woman on the pavement would not leave his mind. He did not know why he had stopped for her, or why her fragile shaking hands followed him hours later, but the echo lingered, like an unanswered question. The evening news played on silent monitors as he reviewed charts and acquisition plans, and nothing in the language of profits could quiet the strange pressure in his chest. Meanwhile, Lena sold the last of her textbooks for grocery money and tried to calculate how long she could survive without work in a city that took without pausing. She ate crackers in the dark and timed her breaths between waves of nausea, while the whisper of new life inside her grew with each painful hour. When Linda returned again with threats, Lena stood her ground with a voice she barely recognized as her own, and said no with a strength born of terror and love colliding at once. Her mother spat curses and left with promises of consequences, and Lena spent the night locked in the bathroom with her fingers laced protectively over the place her abdomen had only just begun to change. The next morning, a notice of eviction lay taped crookedly to the door, and the finality of it broke something open inside her. She walked for miles that day searching for any sign of work, and was refused with polite smiles that never reached the eyes of those who saw only a girl already disappearing. By dusk she found herself again near the pharmacy where she had collapsed only a day before, and hesitated beneath the glow of its lights with a sudden, strange pull toward that quiet moment of kindness that still felt unreal. Inside she purchased the cheapest vitamins she could afford, and paused at the counter when her hands began to shake again. A familiar voice spoke her name, though she had never given it, and when she looked up she saw him standing there with quiet surprise, softening his features as if fate had bent a fraction closer than intended. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, without knowing why his concern was immediate, or why her face stirred something unsettled in him. She nodded and offered a small, fragile smile that did not belong to someone with nothing left, and thanked him again, though the words felt far too small to contain what his unknown gesture had given her. Outside the window, traffic streamed past, unaware that two trajectories had just brushed against each other again without either understanding how violently they would soon collide. That night, as Lena lay awake in a borrowed bed, listening to the distant sirens and pressing both hands to her belly. She whispered into the dark that she would find a way somehow, and for the first time since the test in the public restroom, she did not feel entirely alone. Across the city, Ethan stood by his window with the reflection of his own shadow, staring back, and for reasons he could not name, he held the memory of her eyes in the rain, as if the future were already leaning quietly against him, waiting to be recognized. The call reached Ethan just after dawn, while the city was still holding its breath between night and commerce, and the voice on the line spoke with the careful weight of people who feared what knowledge could do to power, telling him that a routine hospital screening had flagged a pregnancy tied to a confidential patient profile, and that the data pointed in his direction as the presumptive father pending verification. He sat motionless with the phone pressed to his ear, while the skyline brightened beyond the glass, and the old certainty that he could never be a father rose like a wall in his chest, because 5 years earlier surgeons had mapped the damaged pathways and spoken the word permanent with the cool precision of science, and he had built his life on that verdict as if it were stone. Within hours, Margaret Blackwell summoned the inner circle to a private level of the hospital, where the corridors were quiet enough to hear ambition breathing, and when Ethan entered the room he felt the faint tilt of destiny before anyone spoke, because screens were already awake with charts and timestamps and a single word that should have been impossible according to everything he believed about his body. Pregnant, the doctor said with the clinical neutrality that made the air feel thinner, and twins, another voice added, as if it were merely a footnote to a miracle, and the room tightened as the matriarch closed her fingers around the edge of the table and asked for certainty, in a tone that allowed none to be denied. They had found the young woman through intake records linked to a charity ward referral and a private incident report that traced back to a winter storm and a tenant eviction and a pharmacy purchase of prenatal vitamins paid in cash. Each breadcrumb felt like a confession written by a future that had chosen its own handwriting. Ethan asked for proof with a voice that betrayed neither hope nor fear, and consent was obtained hours later through intermediaries who spoke kindness as procedure, and when the vial of blood was drawn, the air seemed to thrum with the weight of everyone who had ever told him there would be no heirs for the Blackwell name. In a lab that glowed with sterile light, the machines began to speak in percentages and probability curves, and the waiting stretched until time felt liquid, and when the final analysis loaded, the numbers aligned with a certainty that refused to be negotiated, confirming with modern ruthlessness that the twin fetuses carried his genetic signature beyond dispute. The sentence that followed felt carved into him, as he whispered it aloud without realizing he had spoken. So everything I believed about myself was a lie, and the words did not fail, gentle but detonated inside his chest as grief for the man he had been collided with terror for the man he was about to become. Margaret closed her eyes for one brief, unguarded second, and when she opened them, the future was already being organized in her gaze, as if destiny were an acquisition to be stabilized and protected. Yet even she could not disguise the tremor that ran through the room when the impossible turned into policy. When she finally tore the seal, her breath stuttered as the words swam into meaning, and the confirmation of twins blurred into tears that were equal parts joy and mortal dread, because 2 lives meant double the wonder and double the risk, and a future that would demand more courage than she had ever been asked to name. The knock at the door came before she could steady herself, and when she opened it, the corridor was filled by strangers with sympathetic eyes, who spoke of safety and resources, and a family that wished to ensure her care, and she understood at once that the man from the rain had already found her, without ever knowing her name. Lena refused the first offer out of instinct, and the second out of pride, and only agreed to a conversation when the nausea surged again with a violence that stole her balance, and somewhere in the city, Ethan felt the same hollow pull in his chest that had followed her since the night she vanished from the street. They did not meet that day, but their lives moved closer along lines that could no longer pretend they were parallel, because the Blackwell board began to whisper of containment and narrative, while doctors revised charts that had once promised an ending and now demanded preparation for a beginning no one had rehearsed. By the time night fell on the new truth, Ethan stood alone in the darkened office, where his old medical report lay folded in the drawer like a relic from another belief system, and he stared at the reflection of his own eyes in the glass, understood that medicine had not only defied him but had called him into a future that would judge every choice he made from this moment forward, with belief that nothing in life would be simple again. Lena crossed the iron gates of the Blackwell estate just before dawn, with a borrowed coat wrapped tight around her shoulders, and a silence pressing down on her chest that felt heavier than fear, as the house rose before her like a living thing, all glass and stone and shadows that seemed to study her. In return, the staff moved with quiet precision that made every footstep feel like an intrusion, and when she was guided inside she felt the weight of unseen eyes, assessing the smallness of her next to the scale of the world she had stepped into by accident. No one called her by name at first, and no one offered welcome, as if she were an object delivered rather than a person invited. And when Margaret Blackwell finally appeared at the top of the staircase, her gaze swept over Lena with the cold authority of someone who had measured dynasties and broken them with equal calm. "You will be safe here," the matriarch said, without warmth or malice, as though safety were a logistical detail rather than a human concern, and Lena nodded, because there was nothing else she could give. A nurse escorted her through corridors that smelled of polished wood and restrained power, into a guest room that was larger than the apartment she had just lost, and left her there with a set of clothes folded neatly on the bed and rules, delivered in a tone that assumed compliance. "The doctors need you rested," the nurse said, "and your movements limited until further notice," and Lena swallowed the words that crowded her throat, because the truth was, she had never rested a day in her life without paying for it later. When she was finally alone, she sat on the edge of the bed and traced the seam of the fabric with numb fingers, struggling to reconcile silk and marble with eviction and borrowed floors and the quiet terror that still pulsed in her blood. Downstairs, Ethan moved through familiar rooms that had suddenly turned foreign with new meaning, because every wall now held the echo of a future he had never prepared for. And when he learned that Lena had been shown to the East Wing, stopped so abruptly that the man walking beside him nearly collided with his shoulder. "She is not a visitor," he said, before he understood. The words had already left his mouth, and when the reply came back that she was a patient and a liability, he felt the first stir of anger he had not measured. That evening, Margaret ordered a precautionary ultrasound in the private suite upstairs, and Lena lay trembling on crisp sheets as cold gel touched her skin, and the screen glowed with shapes that were not yet shapes of anything she could imagine as real. The doctor spoke softly and pointed to the flicker that pulsed like distant starlight, and said, "There are 2 heartbeats," and the words did not arrive with wonder but with the raw ache of reality settling into bone and marrow alike. Ethan stood at the threshold and did not know how long he had been watching before he realized he had not moved at all, because the room felt suspended between past and present, and the sound that filled the air was not the machine but the sound of the sea, confirmation that what had once been impossible was now relentless. When the nurse stepped out and left them alone, neither spoke at first, and the silence did not feel empty but charged with everything that could not be said without changing the shape of both their lives. "I will be nearby tonight," he finally said, not as a command but as a statement that surprised him with its own truth, and Lena nodded with eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if she could anchor herself there against the foundations shifting beneath her. Hours later, when the mansion slept and only the soft movement of security cameras traced the dark, Ethan returned to the suite where Lena lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sound of her own breathing, in a room built for people who never worried about the cost of air. He sat in the chair beside the bed without ceremony, and asked if he could listen again, and when she did not answer right away, he added that the machines recorded waves and rhythm and logic, and for the first time, his voice carried the uncertainty of someone standing at the edge of belief. The nurse wheeled in the portable monitor and left them as quietly as memory, and when the signal resolved into steady sound, Ethan closed his eyes and let the rhythm thread itself through him until the distance between the man he had been and the father he might become narrowed into a single, steady pulse. Lena turned her head and watched him as he leaned forward, hands clasped as though in prayer, and the sight unsettled her more than fear ever had, because no one had ever waited through the night for anything that belonged to her. The hours blurred into a quiet vigil, and when the sound of the monitors became the cadence of breathing itself, Ethan remained as if movement might shatter what fragile order had just begun to exist. Near dawn, fatigue drew his head forward, and he slept in the chair, still holding the edge of the bed, as though the contact alone were an anchor against disappearance, and Lena shifted carefully and placed a folded blanket across his shoulders with trembling hands that had cleaned other people's rooms all her life but had never been asked to protect anything so close. At first light, Margaret entered without warning, and took in the scene in silence, as if measuring not weakness but transformation, and when Ethan stirred awake, he met her gaze without flinching for the first time since the impossible had arrived in his life. She said nothing, but the room held an unspoken shift, because the accident she had feared now breathed with its own will, and the lions that ruled this house would have to decide what to do with the life that had entered their den without permission. Vanessa Reed learned about the twins the same way she learned everything, through a quiet warning, whispered by a woman who owed her too many favors, and a shadowed file slipped across a private table that confirmed the impossible with clinical indifference, and left no room for disbelief. She sat in the velvet booth of a rooftop bar, with the city spread beneath her like a conquered map, and did not blink as she read that 2 heartbeats were now tied to the man she had already decided would be hers, by alliance if not by love. The shock passed quickly, and calculation took its place, because Vanessa had been raised to believe that bloodlines were managed, not protected, and that heirs were assets until proven otherwise. By nightfall she had traced Lena to the east wing of the Blackwell estate, and learned just enough to know that the girl was alone inside that fortress of power, without allies who could survive a long war. What Vanessa did not expect was to find the address of Linda Carter, buried in the background check, like a loose thread waiting to be pulled, and within hours, she was sitting across from the woman in a dim diner off a Texas highway where the air smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. Linda squinted at her with suspicion that quickly softened when the first roll of cash slipped across the table, and the words that followed were spoken with the kind of gentleness that hid a blade. "That baby will ruin your daughter," Vanessa said quietly, "and you and I both know she does not survive real pressure on her own." Linda said nothing at first, but her hands twitched once toward the money, and that was enough. The plan unfolded in stages, clean enough to pass for mercy, and dark enough to leave no fingerprints in the bright rooms of New York power. They would not force Lena into a confrontation that could be traced. They would offer safety and medical care, and send her somewhere quiet, where voices would not reach her, and questions would not rise once the problem was resolved. The clinic would move on within days, as it always did, crossing state lines under new names and new licenses that existed just long enough to vanish. By the time Margaret Blackwell noticed anything out of place, the heirs would already be statistics instead of futures, and Vanessa would step into the vacuum with sympathy and order. She returned to the city before dawn, and feigned composure and concern as she arranged morning tea with Margaret, speaking softly of stock projections and social unrest, while her mind orchestrated a private extinction. Meanwhile, Lena felt a subtle change in the air around her, long before any threat showed its face, as if the walls themselves had begun to lean inward with questions she could not hear. The nurses grew more watchful, and the schedules shifted without explanation, and on the third afternoon Vanessa appeared at the gate with a smile that never reached her eyes, carrying boxes of rare fruit, and wearing grief like couture as she spoke of danger spreading through the city and the wisdom of relocation to somewhere quieter and safer for the babies. Lena listened with a polite distance she had learned from years of saying yes, when no was the only truth she owned, and when Vanessa mentioned a new medical facility in Texas that specialized in high-risk pregnancies, something in her chest tightened with warnings she could not yet name. That night, Linda called from a number Lena did not recognize, and spoke with brittle emotion of regret and illness, and begged her daughter to trust one last time, and come south where family still meant protection, and where the rest promised rest and recovery. The words landed like old bruises, and Lena lay awake long after the call ended, with the image of her mother standing between 2 futures, both steeped in loss. Ethan sensed the disturbance before he understood it, and found Lena alone in the garden beneath the security lights, with tears balanced at the edge of her lashes, as if waiting for gravity. She did not tell him everything, only that she felt hunted in a place that claimed to shelter her, and he felt the stir of dread, like a knife sliding free inside his chest. When he reached for his phone to initiate a quiet investigation, Margaret had already begun one of her own, though their motives aligned without knowing it, and what Vanessa did not realize was that her movements had started to cast longer shadows than she intended. Still, the trap closed with patient precision, because Linda arrived at the estate gates 2 days later in a borrowed car, with shaking hands and the echo of rehearsed despair in her voice, and Lena stood frozen behind the glass as years of longing and fear warred across her face. She agreed to speak with her mother privately against the warnings of logic, because hope had always been her most dangerous weakness, and in that conversation, Linda planted the final seed by describing the clinic as a place of safety run by grounds to fresh safe, old friends who owed her nothing and everything, and Vanessa waited at a distance, confident that the nets were already tightening. That evening the confirmation arrived through coded messages and quiet nods, as routes were mapped and vehicles prepared and medical equipment loaded under false registration in a rented warehouse outside Austin, where power could be lost and regained without headlines. Vanessa stood alone on her penthouse balcony and watched the lights of the city ripple like 1,000 fragile promises beneath her, while she whispered that nothing worth building came without demolition, and that the Blackwell future would not be shaped by a girl who cleaned other people's floors. Far away, Lena pressed both hands to her stomach and tried to quiet the unease that had begun to move beneath her ribs, like something alive and afraid, because somewhere between New York and Texas death was already being scheduled. Morning broke with the sound of helicopters circling above the estate, and Lena woke to the vibration of distant blades echoing through glass and marble, as if the sky itself were knocking for her. By the time she reached the sitting room, every screen in the house was already alive with her face pulled from blurred surveillance footage and framed by words that stripped her of breath: gold digger, escort, opportunist. Commentators spoke with the confidence of people who gamble with other lives and lose nothing when they are wrong. Outside the gates, reporters gathered like weather at rapid speed. Vanessa stood somewhere just beyond the frenzy, with her phone angled low and her expression suitably disturbed, as she released the final clip that would turn suspicion into verdict. The video showed Lena entering the estate late at night, months earlier, and the edits stitched meaning where none had been intended. A breathless narrator implied transactions that never existed, and the lie moved faster because it was dressed as revelation. Across the city, Ethan watched the footage loop in silence, as his security chief spoke urgently about stock exposure and coordinated attacks on the company that were already in motion. Lena was escorted through a service corridor toward a waiting car, as voices rose at the gate with questions sharp enough to cut skin. And when she faltered, a guard tightened his grip just enough to remind her she had become a protected liability rather than a guest. She asked for Ethan and received only averted eyes. In a private boardroom miles away, he was being shown live numbers in red that slid downward with every rumor and with every lie, and Vanessa's words pressed like a hand around his throat, even through intermediaries that chained his silence shut tight. The threat arrived without poetry, delivered in clean language that knew its price and its leverage. If he spoke now, if he denied the accusations publicly, if he claimed the unborn children as his own, then a file would surface detailing algorithmic trading irregularities tied to one of his early acquisitions. The evidence was forged, but the reaction would be real, and the collapse would be immediate. Hospitals would close, jobs would vanish. The woman he wanted to protect would become the face of that ruin. Silence was the only door not already on fire, and he chose it anyway. Lena heard the roar before she saw it, as the car rolled toward the gate, and the crowd surged like a living tide, with faces twisted by certainty borrowed from headlines. Someone shouted that she should be ashamed. Someone else called her a thief of futures. Eggs burst against the windshield and slid downward in yellow grief, as hands beat against the glass. Her phone vibrated endlessly with strangers telling her what she was. Through the chaos, she searched for one familiar voice, and found only the echo of her own breathing as the car jerked forward at last, slow. Ethan stood before a press wall later that day with cameras poised like instruments, and every fiber of him screaming to speak, while his mouth held closed by the arithmetic of damage. Questions rained from all sides, and he gave no answers, and the silence devoured him from the inside out. Commentators declared his quiet confirmation of guilt within minutes, and markets responded with their own brutal language. Across town, Lena watched on a cracked television in a borrowed room and felt the final thread of hope inside her tear loose, as rain began tapping the window like accusation again. By evening, the headlines had hardened, and the tone shifted from curiosity to verdict, and Lena could no longer step outside without being chased by voices that demanded confession and punishment in the same breath. She pulled her hood low and walked fast through backstreets that smelled of rain and oil and fear, while messages from unknown numbers piled into her phone, with threats written as certainty. The world had chosen a story for her, and even the man whose blood bound their fates had not contested it. The loneliness was louder than the crowd that hunted her still. In a quiet room far from cameras, Ethan listened to the recording of the threat again and again, as if repetition could carve a path he had not yet found, and when the voice reached the part where patient lives were listed as leverage, something in him broke with a soundless fracture. He imagined closed wards and darkened halls, and doctors turning people away because he had chosen defiance, and the weight of those imagined losses pressed against his ribs until breath became effort. Still, he saw Lena face in every pause, and the rain her hair would leave him. Lena reached the river by nightfall and sat on the wet concrete with her back against a locked fence, as city lights fractured across black water, and her body shook with exhaustion she could no longer disguise. She tried to call Ethan once, and the call failed with the cold efficiency of networks clogged by narrative, and she laughed softly at the cruelty of it. When she finally stood, she felt the pull low in her abdomen, and panicked at the thought that even fear could harm what she was trying to protect. She whispered an apology to the dark. At the same hour, Vanessa watched the trending charts climb, and felt the thrill of momentum carry her forward, with the certainty of someone who had already paid for the ending she desired. Allies in finance amplified the scandal with measured cruelty, while hired voices across networks repeated the same suspicions, as if they were conclusions worn smooth by truth. She raised a glass to the screens and toasted to a quiet extinction that would not require funerals, and the city answered with numbers that told her she was winning. The heirs were still alive, but the ground beneath them. Margaret studied the coverage in silence, with hands folded and eyes that had survived wars of reputation before this one, and she did not speak Ethan's name as he stood beside her like a shadow pulled from its source. She understood the nature of financial siege, and the patience of enemies who choose indirect fire, and for the first time in years, she felt the tremor of a threat that could not be crushed with a single decision. When she finally turned to him, she did not ask what he would do, but what he was willing to burn everything. Ethan closed his eyes and nodded once with the weight of a vow he had never planned to make, and in that instant, the war shifted from balance sheets to blood. Somewhere along the river, Lena stood shaking beneath a street lamp that flickered like a failing pulse, and pressed both hands to her belly, as another wave of fear passed through her, and did not know that the silence she believed was abandonment was the last barrier holding back a storm. The day the world turned against her was not finished with either of them yet, and the night gathered. Lena disappeared before dawn without leaving a note or a trail that cameras could easily follow, because fear had made her patient and silence had taught her how to vanish through cracks that power rarely bothered to see. The borrowed room was empty when security arrived, and the river fog had already swallowed the last direction she had walked, with her hood low and her heartbeat counting the seconds between survival and collapse. When Ethan learned she was gone, the news struck him not as loss but as accusation, because her absence felt like the final verdict on his silence, and he turned inward with a violence that left no room for justification. Margaret moved through the house with clipped urgency and summoned the intelligence network she had built long before Ethan was old enough to understand what loyalty cost on both sides of the equation, and within hours, the web began to tighten around those who had orchestrated the public execution. The first name surfaced with no delay, and it was one that rewired the meaning of betrayal in Lena history, because the path of the leak did not lead only through Vanessa's hands, but through the trembling signature of Linda Carter, who had sold the mobile clinic location and access routes in exchange for a promised payout she would never live to spend comfortably. Ethan read the report in silence, and felt something inside him split cleanly down the center, not in rage but in clarity, and the part of him that had still believed in strategic patience dissolved with the ink on the page. He replayed the threat recording once more and then shut the device off with a finality that startled the men around him, and said there would be no more waiting and no more containment, and that if his empire was going to burn, it would burn in daylight for the right reasons. Within the hour, he ordered the suspension of automated stock protections, knowing exactly what it would trigger, and scheduled a live broadcast across every platform he controlled, without leaving room for advisors to soften the edges of what was coming. As screens assembled and numbers began their violent descent, Ethan stood alone in the control room with the knowledge that his silence had broken one woman, and his voice might shatter everything else he had built, and he chose his words not as a defense, but as an apology spoken too late to keep blood off the ground. When the live signal opened, he looked directly into the lens with eyes that no longer cared for consequence, and said that the children Lena carried were his, and that he had known, and that he had failed to speak when the truth was under attack, and that this failure was his alone. The market reacted in seconds, and analysts shouted over one another as the numbers plummeted with the hunger of systems that punish vulnerability and reward cruelty, and hospitals that bore his name across 3 states went dark on tickers with the speed of falling glass. He accepted every collapse without flinching, because for the first time, the loss aligned with the cost of his choosing, and he told the audience what Vanessa had done and what had been offered in exchange for his silence, and how he had chosen wrong when it mattered most. When the broadcast ended, he left the tower without security, and without waiting for the storm that had already begun to follow him through flooded streets and shattered camera lines. Lena had taken refuge in a half-boarded house near the river where the roof leaked, and the walls carried the ghosts of storms past, and when the first knock came she feared it was Vanessa's hand, reaching through consequences and curled in on herself with both hands over her abdomen, as if she could shield the twins from the sound of what hunted her. The knock came again louder, this time with desperation instead of threat, and she did not move until the door cracked under the weight of it, and Ethan's voice spilled into the dark with the rough honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. She opened the door to rain and ruin, and the sight of him standing there soaked and shaking with his knees already bending as if the weight of the world had found its inevitable conclusion. The streetlights flickered over, pooling water and sirens sounded far away as he stepped forward and dropped to the ground without pride or pretense, and pressed his forehead to the pavement before her feet. "I chose wrong," he said, and the words tore through him with the clean pain of truth. "I chose money and fear, and I let them turn you into a sacrifice, and I will spend whatever remains of me undoing what I should never have allowed." Lena stared down at him with a stillness born of exhaustion rather than indifference, and the rain soaked through her sleeves as she shook with a blend of fury and grief that had no language left. "You let them destroy me," she said, without raising her voice, and the quiet hit him harder than any scream could have. He did not answer with denial, because there was none that could reach across the choice he had made, and instead bowed his head lower into the water, and said only that he would earn the right to speak again with actions she could see rather than promises he did not deserve to give. Lightning cracked the sky and illuminated the street in white silence, as the moment stretched between them, with the weight of everything that had been lost in its shadow, and Lena felt the twins move within her with a fragile insistence that cut through the numbness like a pulse seeking recognition. She did not forgive him, and she did not send him away, and that fragile interval became the first unsettled territory between collapse and rebuilding, where the storm still raged but the ground no longer shifted without warning. From the darkness behind, Ethan's footsteps approached, as Margaret's security team arrived with vehicles that idled at the edge of decision, and in the distance, the networks recalculated their narratives, with new information they could not yet tame. Vanessa watched the broadcast replay from a private suite with disbelief cracking her composure, as the consequences of an unplanned confession rippled through alliances that had once been silent and stable, and for the first time the ground beneath her certainty faltered with the tremor of exposure. Lena closed the door, not as a gesture of retreat but of boundary, and leaned against the frame with tears finally breaking through the wall she had built to survive the day. And as Ethan rose unsteadily from the pavement, he understood that kneeling was only the beginning of what his repentance would demand. The storm receded from the city in slow, uneven breaths, and what remained between Lena and Ethan was not peace, but a fragile, suspended quiet, where every movement had to be chosen with care, because the wrong sound could still shatter what had just begun to stand on unsteady ground. They returned to the estate under reduced media pressure, shaped by influence rather than command, and the story outside fractured into arguments that no longer agreed on a single villain. While inside the East Wing, Lena learned how to live, again, in measured steps that respected the uncertainty of safety. Ethan did not mention marriage, and did not reach for ceremony or symbols, as if he understood instinctively that rushing toward a ring would turn love into explanation rather than choice. Instead, he stayed nearby without hovering, and spoke only when she invited him into the quiet space she needed to rebuild herself from the inside. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the tall windows, he fell asleep again in the chair beside her bed, with exhaustion pulling his shoulders down, and the faint sound of the heart monitor threading time into something almost peaceful. Without waking him, Lena retrieved the small sewing kit she kept hidden in her bag and studied the torn seam along the cuff of his coat, where the storm had claimed its share. Her hands moved with the steady concentration born of years spent repairing the lives of others through small practical acts, and each stitch became a question she did not yet have words for. As she closed the fabric around the wound, the quoting, "Rain had made." When he woke at dawn, he found the thread and followed it to her still form by the window, and in the quiet recognition that passed between them, no promise was needed because care had already spoken. Later that day, Margaret summoned them both with a restraint that signaled not control but caution, and laid out the next phase of strategy that would protect the children without turning Lena into a public symbol and Ethan into a confession. Trapped in headlines. Lawyers would proceed quietly, and investigators would sever the remaining financial ties that gave Vanessa leverage, while medical supervision would be adjusted without fanfare, and travel restricted without imprisonment. When Margaret finished, she looked to Ethan and said nothing that resembled instruction, and in that silence the responsibility transferred without ceremony from one generation to the next. That night, Lena asked him why he had not proposed yet, when it was what the world seemed to expect, and he answered with a truth he had carried since the river, that he did not want her to marry him because she was pregnant, and that he wanted her to marry him because she chose him without fear or debt, or the weight of legacy pressing her voice into silence. The answer surprised her with its patience and unsettled her with its sincerity, and for the first time she felt that the future had not already been decided by headlines or bloodlines, but remained open to intention. While they moved cautiously forward, Vanessa watched from a distance with a fury that sharpened into decision because the collapse she had planned had been delayed by a factor she had failed to calculate, which was that Ethan had chosen to burn his own reputation rather than preserve hers through quiet sacrifice. The investigations that followed narrowed her options with every passing day, as allies hesitated and accountants went suddenly unavailable, and code words that once opened doors were returned with silence. She shifted the plan decisively from persuasion to removal, and the mobile clinic was repositioned through a new shell company, linked only through proxy registrations that blurred the trail long enough for one final operation to be possible. Linda answered the next call with trembling eagerness when Vanessa promised a closing payment that would wash away every debt and consequence alike, and when she agreed to lure her daughter under the pretense of illness, the betrayal sealed itself without hesitation. The message arrived on Lena's phone that afternoon, marked urgent and private, with an address in Texas she did not recognize, and a voice message from her mother, layered with manufactured regret and fear that pulled at the oldest wounds still tender beneath the skin of their silence. Ethan read the message over her shoulder and felt the cold edge of recognition when the coordinates aligned with routes his investigators had only recently begun to untangle, and for the first time since the storm a different kind of dread returned to him without spectacle or cameras to shape it. He tightened security without turning it into confinement, and chose discretion over confrontation, choosing not to reveal the trap yet in order to follow it to the place where it would finally expose itself. Lena felt the children move stronger now, with a steady insistence that no longer felt abstract, and the knowledge anchored her to a future that insisted on being protected rather than feared. That night, the ring Ethan carried remained in his pocket, and the question remained unasked, not because intention had faded, but because timing had become the most honest form of respect he could offer. Outside the estate, the narrative shifted again, as commentators adjusted their certainty to fit new evidence, and public opinion loosened its grip on the simplified version of blame, while the real danger moved quietly beneath that surface, toward a point no headline could yet reach. Somewhere between New York and Texas, engines turned over in rented yards, and medical equipment was loaded under cover of night, and Vanessa watched the schedules align with the calm of someone who believed that delay had only improved the precision of the ending she still intended to deliver. Lena agreed to the appointment only after the message repeated for the third time, and each replay carried a tremor of weakness in her mother's voice that did not sound entirely manufactured. Ethan insisted on sending security, but she asked for space dressed as normalcy, and he compromised by following at a distance through a trail of quiet trackers and cars that did not belong to them. The flight south felt unreal, as clouds slid beneath the wings, and the children shifted within her like a reminder that every mile carried consequence now. By the time the car reached the medical address, she had memorized the fear into obedience, and told herself that seeing her mother one last time might be the final loose thread she needed to cut. The building looked like a clinic only in suggestion, with clean windows and a sign that used careful words about wellness and emergency obstetrics, while the parking lot remained almost empty beneath the high Texas sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and electric heat, and a woman in pale scrubs greeted Lena by name before she could speak, and guided her toward a back hallway without asking for paperwork. The speed unsettled her, but fatigue lent its own persuasion, and she allowed herself to be led past closed doors, where no voices answered, and into a room that felt stripped of personality, rather than prepared for care. It was the silence that finally broke the illusion, because even clinics have the language of movement and breath, and this place held neither. The woman left without another word, and the door locked with a sound that did not belong to healing. Panic rose fast and Lena backed away until her shoulders struck the wall, and when the second woman entered with gloved hands and eyes fixed only on her abdomen, the truth struck with such violence that she screamed. Vanessa stepped into view from the shadow near the doorway with Linda beside her, shaking as though the choice had already begun to devour her from the inside. "You were never meant to walk out of this carrying them," Vanessa said, with a calm that made the words feel final, and Linda turned away as if blindness might erase intent. Lena fought with a strength torn straight from terror and maternal instinct colliding at once, and her voice filled the room with the raw sound of refusal as the women advanced. At the same moment, the first alarm rang at the front desk as a signal Ethan had planted quietly once the coordinates began to align, and the security detail that followed his trail accelerated through the town with the precision of something that had waited too long. The struggle became chaos as instruments clattered to the floor and the locked door shuddered under the sudden impact of outside force. Vanessa shouted orders that dissolved into noise as the walls seemed to tremble with approaching weight, and the woman in gloves hesitated just long enough for Lena to strike her hand aside and stumble toward the corner with both arms wrapped around her stomach. The door burst inward with the sound of splintering wood, and the room flooded with uniformed figures and shouting voices that pulled the attackers backward into light. Ethan entered last with his heart in his throat, and the sight of Lena on the floor behind a toppled chair ripped a sound from him that did not wait for language. He crossed the distance in seconds, and dropped beside her with his hands trembling as he searched her face for consciousness, and when she whispered his name the relief nearly crushed him. Vanessa was restrained against the far wall, still screaming that it was too late, and that nothing could stop what she had begun, but the words rang hollow against the swift reality of her capture. Linda sank into a chair near the door, with her face covered as officers cuffed her gently but firmly, and Lena stared at her mother through tears that carried neither surprise nor forgiveness, only the cold recognition of what had been chosen. Outside, the clinic sirens layered into one urgent sound as emergency teams rushed in to assess the damage that fear had inflicted on a body already at war with itself. Ethan refused to release Lena's hand even as they lifted her onto the stretcher, and he moved alongside her whispering that she was not alone and that they were not finished. The ambulance raced through dust and heat toward the nearest trauma unit, and the twins answered the motion with a furious shifting beneath her ribs that stole her breath and drew a soft cry from her throat. Medics spoke in clipped reassurance while monitors sang their uncertain music, and Ethan counted each pulse with a mind that refused to look past the next second. Somewhere behind them, the wreckage of the mobile clinic burned with shouted orders and flashing lights as Vanessa's plan collapsed into evidence and arrest in a matter of minutes. News traveled faster than the highway, and by the time the helicopter lifted from the hospital roof, in the city cameras already waited on rooftops, with lenses trained on the story of what had nearly been lost. Ethan ignored them as he followed the gurney through echoing corridors and signed consent after consent, with hands that shook from more than pressure. Upstairs, surgeons assembled with faces composed into professional calm, and the doors closed on a room where the future would be measured in heart tones and minutes. Lena's consciousness ebbed as medication slid into her veins, and the world blurred into white and distant sound, but through the fog she felt Ethan's mouth press against her fingers, as if it were a thread he could anchor himself to. Outside the operating room, Margaret waited with a stillness that did not crack, and the doctors briefed her in low tones about gestational trauma and risk that could not be predicted with certainty. She nodded once because power had not prepared her for this kind of waiting, and she learned it all the same. Across town, Vanessa sat in the back of a police car with her wrists restrained, and her composure finally gone as the consequences she had believed were adjustable revealed their fixed edges. Investigators listed charges in neutral cadence, while she stared at her reflection in the darkened window, and did not recognize the face that had lost its future in a single afternoon. Linda was processed in silence, a few cars behind her with her shoulders drawn inward as if trying to disappear into a life she had failed to protect. Inside the operating suite, time fractured into decisions, and hands moved in a choreography older than fear, as surgeons fought for two fragile rhythms that faltered and returned in trembling loops. Ethan waited with his forehead pressed to the wall, and the knowledge that every choice he had made had led to this corridor and these doors, and the sound of his own breath counting down what he could not control. When the doors finally opened, the night had deepened, and fate had rewritten itself once more, with consequences that would echo long after the sirens faded. When the ambulance doors burst open at the trauma entrance, the corridor filled with motion and clipped commands, as Lena was rushed beneath white lights that blurred into a single river of glare. Ethan ran beside the gurney until a nurse forced him to stop at the red line painted on the floor, and the sudden separation struck like a physical blow. The twins' heartbeat flickered across the portable monitor in uneven rhythm, and the sound carved into his chest with every stutter. A surgeon demanded consent, and he signed without reading because the words life-threatening needed no translation. Inside the operating suite, 6 surgeons assembled with practiced speed as steel instruments rang softly against trays, and sterile gloves snapped into place with ritual precision. The lead physician called out the complications in steady, measured tones, while anesthetic flowed and Lena slipped deeper into enforced sleep, unaware of the storm of hands preparing to enter her body. Outside, Ethan paced the narrow length of the waiting area, with his phone clenched in his fist, as if crushing the device might bend reality. Margaret stood near the wall, unmoving as stone, with her fingers laced and her eyes closed still. The first incision was made at 2:17 inches the afternoon, and blood followed the blade with a gravity that demanded speed without panic. The room settled into the language of urgent focus, where every second carried equal weight, and no movement was wasted on doubt. One surgeon controlled bleeding, while another worked to stabilize uterine pressure, and a third monitored the fragile responses of 2 hearts that refused to beat in unison. The anesthesiologist adjusted dosage in fractions, while calling out numbers that sounded like coordinates through a storm. Each breath drawn inside the room felt borrowed from chance. In the waiting area, the television murmured with muted coverage of the unfolding arrest in Texas, but Ethan could not follow the images, because his mind replayed only the sight of Lena, fought breath and blood beneath harsh light. He pressed his hands together until his knuckles whitened, and felt the full measure of every delayed choice tightening around him, like a cord that would not loosen. When a nurse stepped out at the 40-minute mark and shook her head slightly, the silence that followed swallowed all sound and set his pulse racing into his ears with merciless clarity. Back inside the suite, the surgeons adjusted their approach as uterine contractions threatened to spiral beyond control, and a sharp command cut through the room demanding immediate intervention to save the first child, while the second waited on borrowed rhythm. The room moved faster, with hands exchanging instruments and flashes of steel and cotton, while suction pulled away what the body could not contain. A cry escaped one of the residents when the first infant was freed into air, and immediately rushed into neonatal hands that coaxed breath from tiny lungs with practiced patience as monitors steadied in response slowly. The second delivery resisted longer, and the strain showed in the tightness of foreheads and the urgent exchange of glances as blood loss continued to challenge the margin between rescue and ruin. The surgeon shifted position and asked for another unit of blood, while the anesthesiologist warned that the numbers were drifting toward the edge of safe return. In the corridor, Ethan felt a sudden cold sweep through his limbs without understanding why, and reached for the wall to steady himself as if some invisible current had passed through him. Margaret sensed the shift at once without needing any explanation. Inside the room, the second heart faltered into an irregular pattern that drew a sharp intake of breath from everyone present and forced the lead surgeon to make the decision that balanced desperation with precision. With one controlled motion, the final effort was made, and after a moment that stretched beyond any measure, the second infant was delivered into the waiting hands that would decide whether the fight had been won or only delayed. The sound that followed was small but unmistakable, and it broke the tension with the fragile cry of a life that had almost been lost entirely. The doors to the suite opened at last, and the physician who stepped into the corridor carried exhaustion in his posture and restraint in his eyes as he approached Ethan and Margaret with careful gravity. "Both infants are alive," he said, and the relief that surged through Ethan nearly dropped him to his knees before the second sentence arrived with the weight of consequence that always trails survival. "Their mother is critical but stable for now, and the next hours will decide what strength remains." Ethan pressed his hands together and bowed his head with a breath that shook now. Lena consciousness drifted in and out on a tide of medication and distant sound, as she felt the absence of the weight she had carried, and the slow return of pain that made its own claim on her body. In the neonatal unit, 2 small forms lay wrapped in light beneath warming lamps, as nurses charted each shallow breath with vigilant care and whispered encouragement that sounded like prayer. Ethan stood outside the glass and watched both worlds at once, the woman he loved suspended between life and loss, and the children he barely knew beginning a fight they had began. Margaret entered the recovery unit alone, and stood at the foot of the bed with the same gravity she had carried into boardrooms for decades. Yet her voice softened when she spoke Lena's name, as though the syllables themselves demanded gentler handling. "You have given this family back its future," she said, and there was neither command nor condition in the statement, only recognition of debt. Lena could not answer, and the space between them filled with machines and breath, and the faint promise of what might come if the line held. In the hallway, Ethan finally allowed his legs. Through the night, the machines whispered, and the nurses moved with quiet consistency, as Lena's body fought its way back from the edge, using resources even the surgeons could not fully explain. Ethan remained seated on the cold hallway floor until dawn painted the far windows with pale gold, and exhaustion pulled him into a sleep broken only by the echo of neonatal alarms down the corridor. Each time he woke, he checked the numbers on the chart beside him, as if they were coordinates that could guide him back to certainty if he stared long enough until reality returned. Just before sunrise, the doctor returned with a quiet update that Lena's vital signs were strengthening, and that the immediate danger had begun to recede, though the road ahead would remain fragile for weeks to come. Ethan thanked her with a nod that held more gratitude than speech could shape, and rose at last, with stiff limbs and a spine that felt newly weighted with purpose. Across town, Vanessa's first night in custody unfolded without ceremony, and the walls did not answer her questions or her threats as the certainty she had built her identity upon dissolved into the static. Vanessa spent her first night in custody staring at the metal surface of the holding cell, as if she could still negotiate with the reflection that no longer answered to her name with power attached to it. The room was small and clean and indifferent to the hierarchy she had built around herself, and when the door shut, the sound landed with a finality that money could not soften. Across the corridor, Linda sat wrapped in a thin blanket, with her hands shaking as withdrawal and fear blended into a single, relentless ache, and for the first time in years there was no one left to bargain with for escape. The charges followed in procedural cadence, and the language shifted from what she had planned to what she had done, and the words attempted homicide and illegal medical operation cut through whatever illusions remained. In New York, the doctors spoke in careful tones as they updated Ethan on Lena's condition, with a language that balanced hope with restraint, and told him that the coma was induced to allow her body to heal, without the agitation of consciousness that could tax already fragile systems. He listened without interrupting, and absorbed every caution, as if it were a personal instruction rather than a medical necessity. The twins remained under meticulous care in the neonatal unit, where every gram gained was celebrated in quiet acknowledgement by nurses who had learned to treat miracles as data, until survival made them undeniable. Margaret moved through the legal aftermath with a measured authority that did not boast, because victory carried no joy when it came at such a cost, and she ensured that neither Linda nor Vanessa could leverage confusion or public sympathy to soften what had been attempted. When Linda demanded to see her daughter, the answer arrived without adornment, through a public defender who spoke with careful professionalism, but could not disguise the truth that some doors close because the people behind them have earned their silence. Vanessa attempted threats during intake, and discovered that the reach she had once commanded terminated at the edge of the transport van, and she raged against the restraints with disbelief that her name no longer moved the room. Days turned into a week, and the city adjusted as it always does when scandal settles into the dust of a new cycle, and the public shifted its attention toward whatever fire burned next, leaving the aftermath to those whose lives would carry the scars without headlines. Ethan lived between the hospital floors like a shadow tethered to machines and waiting rooms, and the gentle discipline of nurses who reminded him to eat and rest, because Lena's body would need his strength when her own was not yet returned. Each day he stood at the glass of the neonatal ward and spoke softly to two tiny forms that grasped air with fists the size of his thumb, and told them stories of a future he had not finished imagining but was determined to earn. Margaret visited once in the early hours of a sleepless morning, and watched him through the glass without announcing herself, until he turned and met her eyes with an understanding that required no words, because what had been protected was no longer an abstract legacy but breathing life behind transparent walls. In the county facility, Vanessa prosecution began with evidence that built itself through data and testimony with brutal efficiency, and the narrative she had hoped to frame as cautionary gossip unraveled into manipulation recorded in contracts, bank transfers, and coded messages that no amount of composure could dissolve. She sat through motions with her chin lifted and her hands still clasped, as if the pose itself could persuade the room of an authority long surrendered. But the judge was unmoved by posture and set bail beyond any symbolic reach. Linda bail was denied outright given the medical harm and the weight of parental betrayal embedded in the charges, and she collapsed in the courtroom, weeping not for the babies she had tried to erase, but for the access to her daughter that had once been taken for granted, and was now sealed behind walls she could not climb. In the hospital, Lena's body responded slowly to treatment, with the patient stubbornness of someone who had survived on less, and the doctors monitored pressure, inflammation, and neurological response, with the quiet rituals of people who hold the line between watchfulness and premature hope. Ethan held her hand through the glass of the isolation barrier, and spoke to her about ordinary things, because extraordinary promises felt like a debt he no longer wished to spend in advance. He described the weather and the slow return of spring to the city, and the moment one of the twins curled a finger around his glove, as if testing the claim of connection on their own terms. On the 9th day she stirred with a subtle shift that moved across her face like a question, and the monitors answered with small changes that drew immediate attention from the nurses, who summoned the attending physician with the calm urgency that masks anticipation. When her eyelids fluttered fully open for the first time, the world returned to her in fragments of light and pressure and sound, and the first voice she heard was Ethan whispering her name like it was the only language he still trusted. She did not speak at once, and the effort of awareness brought tears that tracked silently toward her hairline, but she squeezed his hand with what little strength she had, and the gesture carried the promise of survival more clearly than any machine could measure. The doctors allowed the moment to last only a minute before adjusting medication again, and easing her back toward the edge of sleep, but the shift had been made, and the direction of travel was no longer toward darkness. When Margaret informed him that Vanessa would remain indefinitely in custody pending trial, and that Linda's sentencing was likely to include long-term incarceration without parole eligibility for years, he accepted the news not as triumph but as consequence that could not restore what the attempt had nearly undone. He did not ask to see Linda, and she did not ask again. In the weeks that followed, Lena adjusted to the slow return of sensation and memory, with the disorientation common to those who wake with the knowledge that time has moved without them, and Ethan learned to listen without correction as she pieced together the sequence in her own order, because recovery is not linear, and truth does not arrive in clean rows. The twins gained weight and breath with quiet determination, and each milestone marked a victory that asked for no cameras and no narrative beyond what could be shared in a glance between those who had waited. Vanessa's final attempt to influence public perception through an intermediary collapsed when the recordings of her planning were admitted into evidence, and the image she had cultivated over years of curated influence reduced to a paragraph in a legal brief. Linda's withdrawal deepened in custody, and the caretaker she had once pretended to be surfaced only in moments of lucid regret that arrived too late to rebuild what she had traded away. One afternoon, Lena asked quietly what had happened to her mother, and Ethan told her only what was necessary, and left the choice of emotional distance to her, because forgiveness cannot be prescribed without violence to the one who was wounded. She closed her eyes for a long time, and said that she would not carry the weight of that relationship back into her life again, and the decision landed with the calm of someone who had finally recognized the cost of keeping doors open to those who only bring storms. Outside, the hospital spring unfolded without ceremony, and the city kept its rhythm, while inside, small rooms held the gentler battles that never trend and rarely receive names. On a Wednesday just after noon, one of the neonatal nurses brought the twins to Lena for the first time. She was strong enough to hold them both at once, and the weight settled into her arms like an answer she had been waiting for without knowing the question. Ethan watched from the doorway, and allowed himself the quiet certainty that no empire he would ever rebuild could measure against the way the two tiny hearts shifted at the sound of her breathing. Lena woke to the quiet rhythm of the hospital in early morning, when the light was still soft enough to forgive everything, and the world seemed newly stitched together in fragile seams of breath and warmth and possibility. The first thing she felt was the weight of two tiny bodies against her chest, wrapped in cotton and warmth, and the second was the steady presence of Ethan's hand, enclosing hers with a gentleness that no longer trembled. She blinked in slow disbelief, and the room settled into focus with white walls and filtered sun, and the faint sound of machines that no longer frightened her, because now they spoke of stability rather than danger. "You are awake," he said, as if afraid the words might undo the moment, and she answered with a breath that carried both laughter and tears tangled together. The twins shifted softly against her, and she instinctively tightened her arms with the careful confidence of someone who had crossed a threshold she could not return from, and did not wish to. Days passed after that in a rhythm built from feeding schedules and whispered conversations and cautious optimism, as doctors confirmed what hope had already begun to claim, that her recovery was no longer a question of survival but of strength returning, one small measure at a time. Ethan stayed near without shadowing her movement, and learned the choreography of care alongside the nurses, who taught him how to hold both babies at once, and how to read the small languages of hunger and rest written in breath and pulse. Margaret visited without ceremony, and stood beside Lena's bed with a quiet presence that no longer felt like judgment but recognition. And when she touched the twins' foreheads with reverent restraint, Lena understood that the future of the Blackwell name had shifted from abstraction to fragile reality, resting against her heart. One afternoon 2 weeks later, as sunlight spilled across the floor in wide pale shapes, and the twins slept in twin bassinets beside the bed, Ethan knelt slowly at the foot of the mattress, not with urgency but with intention that had learned patience through loss. He did not bring a ring at first and spoke only the truth that had rebuilt him piece by piece since the storm. "I asked you before to choose me without debt or fear," he said, "and I waited because I did not want your yes to come from survival, but from certainty that you wanted this life and this fight with me beside you, even when it is ordinary and when it is hard." Lena listened with a stillness that did not mean uncertainty but depth, as if the answer had been forming in her long before the question fully arrived. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out the ring, at last simple in design and quiet in brilliance, untouched by headlines or spectacle, and held it in his open palm without pressing it forward as demand. The room seemed to pause around them, with even the machine settling into background hush, as Lena studied his face for the first time, not as a figure of power or regret, but as a man who had learned what it costs to kneel and what it costs even more to rise differently. "I do not marry you because of fear," she said softly, "and I do not marry you because of the twins, though they tie us forever in ways nothing else can, and I do not marry you because of your name or what it carries. I marry you because you chose to fall with me when standing would have been easier, and because you stayed after the fall when you owed me nothing but apology." Ethan bowed his head once, as if receiving a vow rather than offering one, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that no longer shook. They did not announce the engagement with press statements or orchestrated images, and the city learned only through whispers and hospital staff, who carried the news outward in fragments of wonder rather than spectacle. When the wedding came, it arrived without grandeur in the small chapel built into the hospital, where light filtered through narrow glass panels and painted the aisle in subdued color like a promise that did not require witnesses to be real. Doctors, nurses, and a handful of staff stood quietly at the back in clean uniforms, because they had carried the story through its most honest chapters and deserved to see where it landed. Margaret wore no ceremonial elegance, only a simple dress, and an expression that held more peace than pride, as she walked her grandson to the front and took her seat without spectacle. Lena was brought in slowly with assistance, not in white lace but in a soft ivory gown that did not disguise the lines of recovery etched in careful motion along her steps. And when Ethan saw her cross the short aisle, the tears arrived, without resistance, because the woman before him carried more courage in her stillness than any battlefield he had ever faced. The twins slept through the vows, nestled safely in a corner beneath the watchful eye of a nurse who had taken on the rhythm of their breathing as naturally as her own, and the ceremony unfolded with words spoken slowly and clearly, as if every syllable deserved to be chosen rather than inherited. When they kissed, it was not for cameras, but because the silence asked for nothing less, and the moment belonged only to them, and the two small lives waiting at its edges. In the weeks after the wedding, Lena's strength returned in steady increments, and the world that had once shouted her name now spoke it with gentler tones, shaped by a narrative she no longer feared. She declined interviews and the offers that followed in polite waves, and instead focused on the outlines of a different future that did not measure worth in attention but in repair. With Margaret's support and legal counsel, she founded the Second Mothers Initiative, a quiet organization built to serve women trapped by coercion and illegal reproductive pressure across state lines, providing legal protection, medical care, and safe passage without cameras or spectacle. Ethan funded it without placing his name at the front, because he had learned the difference between patronage and partnership, and chose the latter without negotiation. The first shelter opened quietly in a borrowed building outside the city, with white walls and wide windows and a staff that spoke in calm voices and asked questions that did not assume shame. Lena visited when strength allowed and sat with women who carried fear in the same places she once had and did not offer solutions as gifts, but listened until the silence made room for them. The twins grew through seasons without urgency, and their small hands learned the texture of skin and light and sound. As Ethan returned slowly to leadership, reshaped by consequences he no longer outran, Margaret stepped back from control one deliberate inch at a time, and found that legacy tasted different when shared rather than commanded. On a quiet evening nearly a year after the storm, Lena stood at the window with one child asleep against her shoulder, and the other cradled safely in Ethan's arms, and watched the city move in distant lines of light that no longer threatened her with disappearance. She did not forget what had been endured, and did not smooth it into romance, but carried it forward as a record of where strength had been claimed from the absence of certainty. Ethan stood beside her without kneeling, and without towering, and for the first time, their shared silhouette in the glass reflected two equal figures holding a future that did not demand spectacle to be real. If you stayed with this story until this moment, it means something in your heart recognized the fight for dignity, love, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again after the world tries to crush you. This journey was never only about billionaires or money, or scandal, or power, or even romance alone. It was about choices made in fear, and choices remade in truth, when fear no longer rules. It was about a woman who could not afford to be pregnant, yet chose to carry hope anyway. It was about a man who believed he was broken beyond repair, and learned that life rewrites every diagnosis. It was about silence that wounded and confession that burned and repentance that had to be proven, not promised. If any part of this story touched you, then you are already part of why stories like this are told and why they matter in a noisy world that often forgets quiet courage exists. Now, I want to ask you something directly, not as a viewer, but as a fellow human. Do you believe that someone who makes a terrible mistake deserves a chance to make it right? Do you believe love can survive public shame, betrayal, fear, and the slow work of rebuilding? Do you believe that a person born into nothing can still become the center of a powerful family without losing the soul that made them worthy? If your answer to any of those questions is yes, then this story was also about you, even if our paths never meet. If your answer was no, then I invite you to sit with that feeling for a moment, because the world will eventually ask the same question of you or someone you love. Stories like this do not end when the screen fades to black, because healing does not follow scripts. It unfolds in kitchens, hospitals, shelters, classrooms, and quiet rooms where no one is watching, but everything is changing. If you know someone who has been judged too quickly, share this story with them, and let them feel seen for one small moment in a harsh world. If you are someone who has been judged too quickly, let this story remind you that your ending is still being written, and no crowd owns your future. And now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what state, what small town, what part of this story stayed with you the most? The river, the hospital, the storm, the silence, the proposal, or the moment Lena chose not to hate her mother? Tell me in the comments, because every answer becomes part of the next story we choose to tell together. If you believe in second chances for broken people, if you believe in love that grows after disaster, if you believe girls like Lena deserve safety and dignity, then tap the like button so this story can reach someone who needs it tonight. And if you want more stories where love has to fight through fear and pride and consequence, then subscribe and walk this road with us again.